Perceptions of autism and Asperger's syndrome in medieval and early modern Europe. In medieval Christendom, roughly 500 and 1500 CE, autism spectrum disorders, ASD, including what we now call Asperger's syndrome, were not recognized as distinct medical conditions. Instead, traits like social withdrawal, intense focus on specific interests, repetitive behaviors, or atypical communication were often interpreted through religious, humoral, or folk lenses. People exhibiting these traits might be seen as touched by God, for example, mystics or holy fools with divine visions, possessed by demons, or simply eccentric villagers integrated into community life without much stigma. For instance, monastic communities provided structured environments that could shelter individuals with ASD traits, offering routine and purpose amid sensory challenges. High-profile figures like the 12th century abbess Hildegard of Bingen have been retrospectively speculated to show autism-like behaviors, such as sensory sensitivities and hyper-focus on theology and music, which were framed as spiritual gifts rather than deficits. Children with pronounced traits might occasionally be labeled changelings, fairy-swapped infants in folklore, but this was not exclusive to autism and applied broadly to any different child. Most were likely raised within families or villages as odd but functional members of society. By the early modern period, c. 1500–1800 CE, perceptions began shifting slightly toward more secular explanations, influenced by emerging medical ideas, but religious frameworks persisted. Asperger's-like traits, high intelligence with social awkwardness, might be viewed as scholarly eccentricity or melancholy, a humoral imbalance linked to genius. However, in rural or superstitious contexts, such behaviors could still evoke suspicion of witchcraft or moral failing. Overall, neurodiverse individuals were often tolerated if productive, but urban growth and social upheaval amplified marginalization for those unable to conform. Yes, Europe transitioned from the late Middle Ages, c. 1300–1500 CE, into the early modern era around the late 15th century, marked by the decline of feudalism, the Black Death's social upheavals, and the Ottoman Empire's pressure on trade routes. This paved the way for the Age of Exploration, or high seas voyages, driven by figures like Christopher Columbus, 1492, and Vasco da Gama, 1498. Sponsored by monarchs seeking new trade paths to Asia, these expeditions, fueled by advances in navigation, cartography, and shipbuilding, expanded European horizons, leading to colonization, the Columbian Exchange, and global empires. For neurodiverse individuals, this era's emphasis on individualism and innovation could reward traits like hyperfocus, for example, in map-making or astronomy. Those sea voyages themselves were grueling and unlikely to attract many with sensory sensitivities. The Italian Renaissance, c. 14th–17th centuries, centered in city-states like Florence and Venice, revived classical humanism, emphasizing human potential, reason, and empirical observation over medieval scholasticism. This shifted views on mental differences. Madness and eccentricity were sometimes romanticized as divine inspiration or linked to genius. For example, Plato's madman as prophet, liberating the voice of madness from pure demonic attribution, as philosopher Michel Foucault later argued. Disability was reframed through humoral theory or as artistic temperament, allowing figures with atypical traits to thrive in patronage systems. The German Reformation, 1517 onward, sparked by Martin Luther's critiques of the Catholic Church, promoted literacy, personal faith, and anti-clericalism, fracturing Europe's religious unity and fueling wars like the 30 Years' War, 1618–1648. It indirectly advanced proto-scientific views by questioning superstition, but also intensified witch hunts in Protestant regions. Overall, these movements fostered greater tolerance for intellectual nonconformity. Humanism celebrated melancholic geniuses, yet reinforced gender and class biases, with women's hysteria or odd behaviors more harshly judged. Trends moved toward viewing mental differences as natural variations rather than solely spiritual failings, setting the stage for Enlightenment rationalism. The European witch trials, c. 1450–1750 CE, peaking in the 16th, 17th centuries with approximately 40,000, 60,000 executions, mostly women, were a perilous time for neurodiverse people. Autism traits like stimming, repetitive movements, intense routines, pattern recognition, for example, predicting weather, or social isolation were misconstrued as sorcery or demonic possession. Women living alone, hoarding odd items, feathers, herbs, common autistic special interests, or showing high empathy for animals, for example, keeping cats, seen as familiars, were prime targets. Texts like the Malleus Maleficarum, 1486, explicitly tied invisible disabilities to witchcraft, amplifying fears in Reformation-era fervor. In regions like the Holy Roman Empire, Scotland, and Norway, neurodiverse individuals, possibly including those with ADHD, OCD, or dyspraxia, faced torture, false confessions, and burning for unwitchly behaviors like tics or sensory aversions to clothing. While some escaped through community integration, many were ostracized or killed, highlighting how religious paranoia weaponized difference. This era's legacy underscores ongoing risks for neurodiversity in intolerant societies. Key witch trial regions: Holy Roman Empire, Germany and Austria, roughly 25,000 executions, stimming seen as spellcasting and routines as rituals. Scotland, about 1,500 to 4,000 executions, animal empathy read as familiars and isolation as malice. Norway and Switzerland, around 300 to 1,000 executions, pattern prediction labeled prophecy and sensory issues interpreted as torment by spirits. Retrospective diagnoses are speculative and based on biographical evidence like letters and behaviors, but several figures from these eras exhibit autism-like traits, for example, social challenges, hyperfocus, sensory quirks. They often contributed profoundly, their eccentricities tolerated or valorized in innovative contexts. Michelangelo Buonarroti, Renaissance, 1475–1564. The sculptor-painter behind the Sistine Chapel ceiling showed solitary habits, obsessive detail orientation, and strained relationships. For example, clashes with patrons. He preferred isolation for years, emerging only for work, aligning with Asperger's high-functioning traits. Contemporaries noted his melancholy genius. Will Sommers, Tudor c. 1486–1560, Henry VIII's court jester, a natural fool with likely developmental disabilities, possibly autism spectrum or intellectual differences. Valued for unfiltered wit and directness, traits that allowed fools to critique royalty safely. He performed at court events, embodying how neurodiversity found niche roles in Tudor entertainment. Jane the Fool, Tudor, FL, 1540s–1550s. Another natural fool under Henry VIII and Mary I, speculated to have learning disabilities or autism traits due to her childlike demeanor and repetitive behaviors. She appeared in royal portraits and provided comic relief, highlighting court tolerance for neurodiverse entertainers. Other Renaissance speculations include Leonardo da Vinci, intense curiosity, unfinished projects, but evidence is thinner. In the Tudor court, fools like Somers and Jane were protected elites, contrasting the era's broader perils for the neurodiverse poor. These figures illustrate how Renaissance humanism and Tudor pageantry could elevate atypical minds.